This is a great deep sky astrophotography setup for the serious beginner. Let's get into it. Hey guys, Chris the Lazy Geek here and welcome back to the channel. Or if you're new to the channel, welcome to the channel. It's a channel all about astrophotography, astronomy and related tips and tricks. If that sounds interesting to you, feel free at any time to go down below and click that subscribe button. For now, let's have a look at this setup. This is one of the most efficient and easy to manage setups for astrophotography, while you can also get amazing results with such a setup. It is really a sweet spot in the hobby. A lot of beginners start with something like that, and it can really last you for years, and it works for intermediate or even advanced astrophotographers. I went back to this setup recently as I suffered an injury and had to go back to something that was small, lightweight and easy to use. And I found when I built this setup back like that this was great for serious beginners and it is worth sharing. So let's start with the beginning. This white block here, this is the mount. The mount is what will basically keep track of the stars as they move across the sky. From our point of view, the Earth rotates, so from our point of view, the sky and the stars rotate. When we look at them with the naked eye, it doesn't seem to rotate that quickly. When you have a telescope that zooms in a lot, well, suddenly they rotate super fast and you need to actually keep track of them. So this thing has a motor in here, that will basically do this follow. And it's actually also what we call a go-to mount. So it has a motor for this axis here, it has a motor also for this axis. And it can, by itself, point to whatever star I tell it to point to. And how do I tell it to point to stars? I use a computer that I have on top of here. So this particular mount is the AZ EQ5 Pro. It is one of the cheaper mounts on the market. It's not the best mount by far, but for a small setup like this, it works perfectly fine. There are other mounts of the same caliber. There's the HEQ5 from the same brand, Skywatcher. There is the Ioptron SEM26 or the GEM28. There's all sorts of brands that are available for this type of mount. They're typically a bit above $1,000, so something to keep in mind. And they usually come with their own tripod at this price level. The higher the price, the less likely it is that your mount will actually come with a tripod. I replaced actually the tripod with a carbon tripod that is available from the brand Cytron Japan, but that's simply because I wanted to keep something that was low to the ground, because one of the enemies of astrophotography is the wind. Wind will actually move the telescope even a tiny bit, and that's enough to throw away some images that you take. And so I have those balcony walls here that help against the wind. That is very prevalent in my region. So when you look for a mount, you want to make sure, I would suggest really as a beginner, you can go with a sky tracker, which will simply have a single motor to keep track of the stars, and then you will need to point your telescope precisely to where you want to image first, your telescope or your camera. I prefer go-to mounts because you can really control everything remotely, which is super convenient, especially when it's winter. I can just open the objectives on my telescope and just go back inside and control everything remotely. When it's cold, that's really nice. Now attached to the mount we have the telescope, that little red and white thing. I'm going to remove that band here. I'm going to explain what this is later. But this telescope is the Sharpstar 61 EDPH2. This is also a great small, relatively cheap for what it is, and very high quality telescope. It has a fairly low focal length of around, I think, when it has the included reducer of 270 millimeters, meaning it doesn't zoom that much. But this is actually something that's counterintuitive for a lot of beginners. For a lot of deep sky astrophotography, you actually do not want to zoom. it's actually quite the reverse. You want to have the widest field of view possible, because so many of those nebulae that we try to capture are huge, absolutely humongously huge. And when you have a telescope that zooms in too much, not only is the telescope bigger and heavier, meaning you need a better mount to carry it and more money to carry it, it's also more of a sail in the wind, so it's going to be more sensitive to wind. Plus, you actually won't be able to capture all of the field of view that you may want to capture, and you may try to compensate by having a bigger sensor in your camera, which is also costing a lot of money. Which is why I really like this kind of small refracting telescope, we call them refractors, that don't zoom too much and that are easy to use. This I really like this telescope. The weakness for me is the bands that hold the telescope here, because the telescope can still rotate a bit within those bands, even when I have them tightened a lot. It's fixable, but it's not great. There is a version of that telescope. It's basically a clone, but with better rings and some other options from OPT/Radian, called the Radian Raptor, which is great. There's also other telescopes of the same type from this Sharpstar brand. There's the Ascar FR 400, something like that, that's very similar. And what's very good with those telescopes is they come with they have a dedicated focal reducer. This black part at the end is actually something I can unscrew from the telescope as necessary. And the reason for that is that the telescope is basically a big lens at the front, or a set of lenses at the front. And this set of lenses will focus light from the stars, not in a perfect plane, but in some kind of an arc like this. But the camera sensor, it's flat. So we have something like this, which means the star in the middle will be in focus, but the stars at the outside won't be in focus anymore. Or we might have different colors that are in a different focus point. So we start getting into a lot of small issues. To avoid that, for the colors part, we try to have multiple lenses at the front. And that's why for astrophotography, we recommend for refractors to have at least something we call a doublet, which means 2 lenses at the front, or a triplet, which means 3 lenses at the front, like this one. The reducer itself will flatten the field. You have other things like a field flattener, but also an advantage of a reducer is that it will reduce the focal length, the amount of zoom that you have. When it does that, it reduces the focal ratio. The lower the focal ratio, the better, because effectively, the more light you have hitting each of the pixels of your camera sensor. So you can afford to expose less time. It's always a compromise between like the zoom that you want, the resolution that you want, the speed at which your image, and how long you're willing to spend on each target. And I think this is a great compromise. There are some telescopes that are called quadruplets or quintuplets, which typically just means that they're triplet at the front and they have a focal reducer integrated at the back that you cannot remove. There's the William Optics Star 71, for example, or you have Telescope Service or Telescope Optics from Germany that have a whole lot of small refractors like that that are either clones of this one, or they're those quadruplets or quintuplets. There's also a very popular telescope, the William Optics Red Cat 51, which is a different design. It's called a Petzval design, and it's also kind of an all-in-one design. I have one problem with it, though. It's the focuser is a wheel that you need to turn, which makes it a bit more difficult to fit an electronic focuser on it, and this is something that I'll come back to in a moment. Now, when you have a telescope with a focal reducer, very often, most of the time, you have a very specific distance that you need to protect between the focal reducer and your actual camera sensor, physically the sensor of the camera where the photons from your target will reach and be converted to electric signals. This distance typically is 55 millimeters, and it can change a little bit depending on manufacturing tolerances and whether you have any filters that are set between the focal reducer and the camera sensor. Now, there are exceptions to that. There are some designs that we call Petzval designs that allow for flexibility in the distance that you have between the focal reducer or the end of the telescope and your camera. The William Optics Red Cat 51 is one of the designs. You can afford to be less precise. And this distance, we call it the back focus distance. It's it's a source of frustration when you first build your astrophotography setup. I have a video on that. I'll be linking to it above, and it's very sensitive. Like 0.5 millimeter is enough to kind of throw up, to make like the stars at the edge of your field of view less good than otherwise. So it's a bit of a painful process, which is why some telescopes that allow different ranges of distance might be less intimidating for beginners. At the very back here, I have the camera. This camera is a camera that is specific for astrophotography. It is only controllable via USB. There's no screen or anything like that, like a normal DSLR. You can use a DSLR for astrophotography, but I personally live in Tokyo. There's a lot of light pollution in Tokyo, and so my only real option for astrophotography is to use a technique that we call narrowband. Narrowband consists of targeting specific colors of a nebula, specific wavelengths that nebula naturally emit, and rejecting everything else. The problem with DSLRs is that typically they reject one of the major signals that we get from those nebulae called H-alpha, and you need to actually go and into the camera, to the sensor, remove that filter from the sensor before it can be really used for astrophotography, which is a bit of a pain. There are DSLRs typically that end with an A at the end, like the EOS RA for astronomy or astrophotography. From Canon, I think Nikon has one, maybe Sony has one. There are cameras that accept more light from that specific color, but still, I would recommend a dedicated camera simply because of one thing. Dedicated astrophotography cameras can be cooled. And cooling the camera is super important. It will reduce what we call the thermal noise of the camera, and that thermal noise can accumulate because we're taking long exposures, 60 seconds, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, and that heats up the sensor. That creates a lot of noise in the image. By cooling actively the sensor, and by that I mean to temperatures like -10 degrees Celsius or -5 degrees Celsius, we're really reducing that noise, and we're also making a process that we call calibration much easier to do, because we can tell the camera to cool to a certain temperature, and then we can take calibration frames that will match the images that we've taken of the actual stars, of the nebulae that we are targeting. I highly recommend such a camera. This particular camera is the ZW ASI 533 MC Pro. Oh yeah, we like simple names in this hobby, and it's a great color camera. It has a very clean, very easy to deal with, very gentle and nice sensor. It's ideal for beginners, and it cools well. It works very well overall, and it also has a fairly small sensor of 1 inch size basically. That sensor is square, and there is actually a big advantage with small sensors, is that the weaknesses that you may have in the optics are less visible in a small sensor, because the bigger the sensor is, the more flat the field needs to be from the telescope. And so the bigger a sensor is, the more field of view you'd be able to capture, which is great. But also it means that you are much more at the mercy of any issues with your optics. So I like small sensors like this for beginners when you don't want to think about exactly micron level distance between your focal reducer and your camera. When you don't want to think about what we call tilt between the camera sensor and the telescope, just go with a small sensor. It makes everything much easier. There are other companies than ZW that use the exact same sensor. So you can also go for any other camera with that same sensor, but make sure that they are actively cooled and not just like a fan. Some vendors have that. It makes no sense. You want something that is Peltier cooled. It's a color camera. I forgot to mention, it's a color camera. In astrophotography, we use a lot of monochrome cameras, and then you will be using color filters. And we'll take one image with a blue filter, one image with a green filter, one image with a red filter, and then we'll be combining them to get a color image. We do that because a monochrome sensor will be more sensitive than a color sensor and have better resolution. But recent color sensors have advanced so much that they're not quite at the same level, but they're very close. And the convenience of a color sensor really makes a big difference, at least for me, for someone who is lazy. One of the things as well is you may have noticed this squarish thing here. This is a filter drawer. I use a 2-inch filter or M48 or 48 millimeter filter between my focal reducer and my camera. And we can look within the filter drawer. Here it is. So we have this filter. This is a multi-band narrowband filter called the Optolong L Extreme. I would say that if you're in an area that has a lot of light pollution, like here in Tokyo, this is a must-have, absolutely a must-have. So it works only on emission nebulae, but it really gives absolutely amazing results, and I highly, highly recommend it. Almost really a must-have for light polluted areas. There are tons of other similar narrowband filters. I have a video on the topic if you want to go in depth. My favorite right now is this one, until someone comes up with something better. The reason I put it in this filter drawer is so that I can change it anytime I want. For example, when I want to take a picture of something else than a nebula, like a galaxy or something like that, I'll be removing it and changing it to a more normal filter, something we call a luminance filter, for instance. It's also good to know that most focal reducers accept that you put a filter at their front. You can remove the focal reducer, screw in your filter, put it back in, but that's too much work for me. I don't want to disassemble my equipment, so that's why I have a filter drawer like that. So we talked about the mount, we talked about the telescope, we talked about the camera, and we talked about the back focus with the filter that I use. And with a camera like that, by the way, you absolutely need at least one filter, a luminance filter, because this cuts ultraviolet and infrared, which can cause your stars to bloom and become bigger than it's not very pleasant in your end images. So you absolutely need that as well. One other thing that we have on here is this reddish thing here. This is called the ZWEAF. It stands for Electronically Assisted Focuser, I believe. It is a cheap electronic focuser, and you can attach it very easily to the telescope, and it's connected via USB to a computer, and lets me remotely focus the telescope. And you might be thinking, like, why would I need to focus the telescope electronically? I could just do it manually at the start of my imaging session. It is true, but this telescope is made of aluminum. Aluminum will expand or contract with the temperature. As the temperature drops, even if the telescope changes size by microns, this is enough to throw your image out of focus. So you want to be able to refocus periodically throughout the night as much as possible. And this is where having an autofocuser like this becomes critical. And I absolutely love this because, again, I can be inside and I can program my astrophotography session to say, like, okay, every hour you're going to stop taking pictures, you're going to just autofocus and then go back to taking pictures. It's done automatically, and I can absolutely be in bed while this is happening. This is absolutely great. I really recommend an autofocuser for the serious beginner. This one is one of the cheapest autofocusers available. The newer models don't require separate power delivery. I'll go into that later. So it can be powered by USB only, which is really convenient. Otherwise, I mean, because this focuser is cheap, it has some drawbacks. It has a lot of mechanical backlash, which is a bit painful, but it's easily correctable in software, and I get excellent, repeatable, good focus with it without any issues. Another piece of this equipment is this band here. This is another thing about astrophotography. Your telescope will be out imaging the whole night, right? Which means that the lenses, which are glass, will get cooler faster than other surfaces. It means that they will reach the dew point faster and will get covered in dew or droplets of water immediately almost, which is not very good. So to avoid that, we want to heat up the lenses to make sure that this doesn't happen. And I have a heating band like that to achieve just that. This particular heating band has an integrated controller that will heat it up to 10 degrees above ambient in Celsius. But there are tons of solutions for heating your lenses. I find that for me, most of the time, I don't need it. But when I do need it, and if I've forgotten to bring it with me, for instance, it's absolutely terrible. So this is also something that I highly recommend having at the start. Now, before I go about the next elements in this setup, I want to mention something very important, which is cables and power delivery. This telescope, in terms of cable, is a mess. Astrophotographers typically like good cable management, just like PC builders, for instance. I will be cable managing this soon. One of the reasons for that is, again, wind and snatches. Your telescope will be moving across the sky, and there's also an operation that you need to do in the middle of the night that can be managed by the telescope automatically if your mount is go-to, which is called the meridian flip. This is a word that makes a lot of beginners tremble in fear, but once you've set it up, it's going to be completely automated and you don't need to worry about it. It's another reason why I really recommend a go-to mount. And during that flip, cables can snatch, and if a USB cable is like snatched out of its slot, you're losing a whole night of imaging, which is really a shame. So there's tons of cables. You want to cable manage them, but I want to go into the power delivery aspect. Most of the equipment requires 12 volt. This camera, it can cool itself, right, to like -5 degrees. For that, it requires external power in addition to USB, and that's 12 volts. This focuser, the newer versions don't require 12 volt, but I have an old version and it requires a 12 volt input. This mount, it requires 12 volt. This heating band, it requires 12 volt. So I have a 12 volt, 6 amps power supply and a splitter that can let me just get everything in. And they are for portability when you're going out of your house for astrophotography. Instead of using, you can simply use a power bank that has a 12 volt output. And typical 12 volt cables and 12 volt splitters from Amazon, very cheap, will let you just connect all of that together. So it's something to keep in mind. In addition to the USB, you have all of those 12 volt power delivery to think about. Now let's go into the next element of the setup, which is this block here. You may have recognized this is a computer. It's a complete Windows computer, and it's connected via USB to everything. Of course, you could just use a laptop and be sitting next to the telescope, but what I like to do is have this computer with like Chrome Remote Desktop or TeamViewer, so that I can just go inside, control this computer from inside, and just have my telescope do anything it needs without me having to physically be here. And so with this computer, I have connected all of the USB cables. So I've connected the computer to the mount. So the computer can give instructions to the mount. I have connected the computer to the focuser. So the computer can give instructions to the focuser. I have connected the computer to the camera. So the computer can give instructions to the camera. And I have connected to the computer to the guide camera. I'll go to that in a moment. So the computer can control the guide camera. So everything is controlled by the computer. Obviously, you need specific software for that. Now, I personally like to use a piece of software that's free and open source called NINA. It stands for Nighttime Imaging and Astronomy. In my opinion, it is, despite being free, the best piece of software that you can use to control your equipment. And it's very easy to use, but I am biased because I contributed a few features and code to this piece of software. I like having a Windows computer because it gives me all of the power to control exactly how I see fit. However, if you've decided to go with a ZWEF, with a ZW camera, and you have a mount that is supported, there is a solution called ASI Air or ASI Air Pro, or very soon they're going to release something called the ASI Air Plus. It's an Arduino based control software that you can control from your smartphone via Wi-Fi. I feel like there's tons of weaknesses with this approach. In particular, their focus routine is definitely inferior to what NINA provides, for instance. And also, like, transmitting data is a bit of a pain. You lose a lot of flexibility, but it's very integrated, and because you can do everything from the smartphone, a lot of beginners actually like that. So it really all depends on how you like to image. I like to have everything is set up. I don't need to do any changes, but I like to have that flexibility to image exactly how I see fit, which is why I use a computer. You can use a computer that's not very powerful. I have a video on that as well. I'll be linking above. And bonus points if you find a computer that's fanless and that has a 12 volt power supply so that you can also use your 12 volt for the computer as well. My computer is not the case, unfortunately. This thing is only available in Japan. It's no longer produced. It uses 19 volts, so I have to use a separate power supply for that. I'm currently looking at replacing that with a 12 volt computer. Okay, so we've looked at the computer. The computer will be controlling this, and that to really, and also the Autoguider. But let's look at what exactly that Autoguider is. So here we are. You can notice that attached to my telescope here is this little gray tube. This little gray tube is actually a little small, tiny, cute telescope in and of itself. It's a very cheap, very low quality telescope, and it is connected to a camera at the back end here. So this camera is also small, cute, tiny, and cheap. I bought those as a set. It's called the QHY Mini Guide Scope, along with the QHY 5ML camera, I believe. It has a weird name. You can see it's connected via USB. This camera is not cooled, so it's just USB connected. And this telescope is single lens. I can almost think it's a plastic lens. It really doesn't really matter. The only purpose of this scope is, along with this camera, is that the computer will ask it to take pictures every second, every 2 seconds, something like that. Like, keep taking pictures, and then it looks at the stars in this picture, and it looks at the positions of the stars in this picture. And then, if it sees that the stars are starting to drift away, even with sub-pixel accuracy, it's a very, very accurate process, the computer will see that and will tell the mount to, no, you're going off track, to correct this. So this is a feedback loop with the mount. And the reason being that it sounds like, we should be able to just rotate at the exact speed of the Earth's rotation. But that's actually not that easy. It's a gear and worm mechanism. And the worm is a type of gear that if you have like a micron level defect on it, super tiny defects, it means that the mount will not be following exactly the star. It might like speed up a little bit or slow down a little bit from time to time. And these speeding up and slowing down can be corrected by the auto guiding. On top of that, for the mount to be accurate, it needs to be perfectly polar aligned. Polar alignment is a very important piece of setting up your mount, and there are great systems to achieve that. One of the systems that I like the most is called SharpCap. It's a piece of software, and there's a new one in Nina that I haven't tested yet. That's a plugin to Nina. SharpCap, I'll put a link to a video above, and the free one, Nina, I'll also put a video once I create that video. So if you don't want to miss that, don't forget to go down below and subscribe. Like, if the polar alignment is not exactly correct, and let me tell you, it usually isn't, it means that there's also a drift that's happening between like the telescope and your target. And so this Autoguider will also take care of that drift. Theoretically speaking, you have tons of techniques to make it work without this Autoguider. You could have perfect polar alignment, and then you can have a technique that is called periodic error correction to correct for the mechanical imperfections of the mount. But that doesn't usually work super well with cheap mounts like this one, relatively cheap mounts like this one. And you can only hope to do real perfect unguided exposure with mounts that cost like maybe $5,000 or something like that. So this is really, this auto guiding thing is something that I highly recommend to have even as a beginner, because with auto guiding you'll be spending much less time losing your imaging time because you're seeing star trails in your images and nothing is working well, and you get frustrated and you abandon the hobby. Now, with this, I want to go to actually like kind of the final part of my setup, which is I am lazy. And to be lazy, it means that I don't want to have to set this up every time I want to image. Something that beginners underestimate is the commitment that the hobby needs. And setting up your equipment can be very painful, really. It takes a lot of time, energy, and you're like looking outside and you're like, oh, it's a clear sky, but I'm so tired, and then you don't do it. For me, I made it so that I can leave my equipment here permanently, but also I can just grab it, put it in the car, and go somewhere else. So that's one of the purposes of the equipment. But wait, how do I leave it outside permanently Well, it's simple. I can just put this under a cover. So what I do is I have desiccant. So this has just desiccant in there. I'm just putting in there, and then I have this cover, which is called the Telegizmo 365 cover. It's made for telescopes to stay outside in the rain, in the cold, in the snow, in the hail, like all day, every day, all year long. And it's as simple as putting it on like that. It just covers everything. Now, this will likely affect the lifespan of my equipment. There will be more rust. Even with this desiccant inside, there will be more humidity. It will get hot in summer, all this kind of stuff. But I am sure that like that, I will be able to enjoy, to have more actual time spent on the equipment, even if the equipment has a shorter lifespan. Because otherwise, I would simply not be using my equipment. With that, to use it, I just need to do this. Remove the cover, remove this, remove the desiccant. I'm done. Now I can go inside and just control everything. It's as easy as that. Because of that, I will be using, and I have been using my equipment a lot. And I think a lot more than if I were very protective of the equipment, but not using it as much. So that's another piece of advice for the beginner. Take into account your commitment and your frustration. It's a very, very addictive hobby. It can be very frustrating. So starting the right way, even if you have to spend dollars, is really important. And having equipment that works for you, that can be automated, and that really can get you committed to the hobby is really important, and it will save you money in the long run. This setup will last you years. And even if you go to a bigger telescope later on, you'll find yourself coming back to this because of how pleasant, easy, and nice it is to use, and because of all the great results you can get. So that was a pretty long video, but I hope it's helped you get a handle on what is, a good, or even in this case, a great beginner deep sky astrophotography setup. And this is an example. I'm not saying you should buy exactly what I bought. In particular, the mount, I think there are better alternatives. This one is very flexible, and it can do visual astronomy as well, very well. But I hope this gives you an idea of what you need to really have a powerful, long-lasting, and easy-to-use setup. So I hope this was useful. If it was, please feel free to go down below, put a like in there. Also give me a comment if you want to know more about the equipment, about how to set up the computer, etc. There's tons of videos that I already have, but I feel like I need to be refreshing those videos from time to time. If you're not subscribed to the channel yet, make sure you do not to miss those videos, so click that subscribe button, that bell icon. But more importantly than that, never forget to look up at the stars, and I'll see you next time.